Hey everyone, welcome back to a new collections video. This time is part 1 of a 2-part special involving limited run. So with that said, this time we're looking at Nintendo stuff, and next time we'll be looking at Sony stuff, and then saving for the last series will be PS4. But with that said, first up we have limited run stuff. One of arguably the oldest in my collection, that being a, of course, reproduction of the classic Night Trap, which was on like Sega CD, the Saturn, as well as 3DO, and others. It is a pretty cool and unique game to say the least. I like it for all of its cheese. Next up is a kind of unusual reproduction cover art of Super Meat Boy. Personally, I like the original, but it had a very limited print, so I had to end up getting this one, unfortunately, and it's definitely way weirder. Also, of course, the back. Of course, all regular games that come directly from Limited also always include a interesting card. Next up, Bloodstain, Hearse of the Moon, which is definitely got some beautiful, I think, definitely cover art, to say the least. Next up is a reproduction of a Nintendo classic, or rather N64 classic, the original Torok. And my personal favorite, Torok 2 Seeds of Evil, which are definitely classics, as back in the day used to play local co-op, and local actually multiplayer mode of Torok 2 was actually legitimately good and a lot of fun. I definitely have a heavy nostalgia for these games, as these were some of my first FPS games I ever played. Next up, we have a remaster of the original classic Myst, which is a great puzzle game series that I highly recommend to anyone. And I find interesting the cover art. Very basic, but it makes sense from the time period when the game originally came out. Which I actually still have. I still have this original version for the 3DO. Next up, we have the remaster, of course, the original Saturn classic, well, remake, Panzer Dragoon. Which I admit, the remake is legitimately great, in my opinion. But also, this comes from somebody who is biased as a big fan of the Panzer Dragoon series as a whole. Next up, another classic from the 90s, a remaster version of Doom 64, which I still stand by. I think Doom 64 is arguably one of easily the best Doom games. Definitely some pretty cool locations and creatures you have to fight. Doom 64 was more or less just really like new maps and stuff as made into a glorified game. Though there is a huge amount of overall content, but trust me when I say, if you like classic shooters like classic Doom and stuff, and you've not actually had the opportunity to play Doom 64, I do highly recommend checking the game out, as usually, digitally, it's very, very cheap. Still, I was happy I was able to get this physical. Next up is the original classic Shantae, which of course is a all-time classic from the Game Boy Color era. Hard to believe that it's actually been around since like 2002. The franchise is now 21 years old. Definitely a pretty cool and unique platformer for the time on the Game Boy Color. Definitely a very good looking game for its age and the fact it was on Game Boy. Also, its direct sequel, Risky's Revenge, but this is called the Director's Cut. Which is cool with new also characters introduced into the franchise, done by, of course, Way Forward Games. Next up, we have a very unique and interesting RPG called Cthulhu Saves Christmas. An interesting indie developed classic 2D style RPG. It's definitely different, that is for sure. That's one thing I like about limited runs, the fact that otherwise a lot of these indie games would have never seen a physical release. Next up, we have an all-time classic from Ubisoft, though there's constantly issues with copyrights, which is you never know how long like a re-release, a limited run is gonna last because of copyright stuff. But it's definitely a classic. Also, if you were a fan of the original movie and stuff, or you like old school style beat 'em ups, this is definitely a great game to play. Also, I think one of the best looking modern 2D games out there for me is To the Moon. Very interesting in the game, but it is gorgeous looking with its sprite work. If, like me, and you grew up in the 16-bit era, you really appreciate stuff like this, and appreciate the fact that indie games are trying to keep the classic sprite style alive. Next up, we have Republic Commando, which was originally a classic on the original Microsoft Xbox. Arguably, probably one of the best Star Wars games that was ever done. And it also was interesting as it was an FPS Star Wars game. There's not exactly a lot of first-person shooter Star Wars games out there. As this ended up being one of the best in quality as well. Also, a very interesting JRPG game, Bug Fables, The Everlasting Sapling. A unique game, and the art style is also cool. It uses a somewhat like cel-shaded art style, but it's not your traditional cel shade. So it's appreciated for its uniqueness. Personally, I wonder if A Bug's Life was somewhat of an inspiration for this game. Also, a pretty awesome double pack that was offered, as I do have nostalgia for games like Zombies Ate My Neighbors. I remember playing back in the day on the Super Nintendo in the 90s. A pretty high difficulty game to play, but still it is awesome seeing classics like that actually get a remaster. Now, I never actually played Gold Patrol back in the day, unfortunately. Also, it's cool the fact it even includes a pair of 3D, old school cardboard and stuff 3D glasses, which is pretty awesome. Next up, we have Super Meat Boy Forever. Obviously, sequel to the original classic. Like the first game, insanely high difficulty curve. It's definitely a game that takes a lot of practice to get good at. But if you're willing to soak in the time, it can be quite rewarding. Next up, Dusk. A spiritual successor of sorts, I guess you could say, to games like Doom, Wolfenstein, Serious Sam, and Quake. But probably one of the best modern, I would say, takes on this specific subgenre of shooters is pretty cool, honestly. A very well executed indie game that obviously has on its sleeve its love and inspiration. Probably quality wise, one of the best sort of copies, I guess you could say. Also, the all-time classic, Knights of the Old Republic, which is awesome. They got a re-release. Being a big fan of the original on the, of course, original Xbox. Still waiting for the second game to get shipped. Next up, a great collection of two superb indie platformers. Love the art style. Very much a heavily influenced cyberpunk style game. That you can tell specifically on certain elements of the stages it was inspired a lot by Super Metroid, as well as I would even say that probably Mega Man X was also an influence on some of the designing. Next up, we have River City Girl Zero, a prequel to the original classic that was never released originally here in the West. It is cool it finally got a release. And if you like old school beat 'em up games like Streets of Rage, Final Fight, and others, you will definitely enjoy the River City Girls series, as the gameplay can be quite addictive at times. Next up, an interesting game that physically only got originally a release on Xbox. Through a limited run was able to get a Switch port, and that is Demon Turf, a very interesting platformer to say the least, as it's got a combination of 2D and 3D, and is definitely very unique compared to many other platformers of modern day. There's quite a bit of complexity to the actual gameplay of this game, but it actually can be quite in-depth. It's definitely not an easy game to master, and you will soak in a lot of hours into the game. Next up, another remaster. Classic Star Wars The Force Unleashed. Now, unfortunately, this is just a remaster of the Wii version, which is not great, because the Wii version of Unleashed was not exactly the best port. So that part does kind of suck, unfortunately. That's the version they chose instead of the PS3 version. Next up, a pretty cool, rogue game, or roguelike game, with a bit lighter on the complexities. It's definitely a great introduction, I think, to the subgenre. If you're curious at roguelike games, Going Under is actually a game I would recommend checking out. Next up, Sea of Solitude, which I've already done back a while back, a full playthrough of this game. It does have a few negatives here and there. Specifically, hitboxes is one issue, but overall, it is a good, I think, a beautiful game overall. And a surprisingly well done game overall as an EA original, which is like the indie division at EA Games, which at least is still allowing some creativity and experimentation. Next up, pretty cool origin game of a classic series of JRPGs. As you see, there's also 3 game modes in this: time attack arena mode, as well as story. And this series goes all the way back to the Famicom. Second to last of the regular Switch games, A Little Golf Journey, which is a cool golf game. And I actually dig the simplistic 3D art style they decided to go with, in the fact also has like a story mode. Very unique and very different compared to many other golf games out there. And golf games is a weird, like, sports genre of gaming I actually really enjoy is golf games, weirdly enough, along with tennis games. Last of the basic stuff for now. Definitely an interesting game that basically you feel like you're inside a toy box and the whole world is inside it. Basically a giant toy box come to life. It is definitely unique and different from many other indie games out there. And in this day and age, you definitely need your own like feel or a certain element to stand out from the rest. Next up, we're going to look at a couple of other things and then collector stuff. First up, a reproduction of the original classic Shantae for a Game Boy Color. And yes, this is an actual reprint of the original Game Boy Color game. Complete in box, and yeah, this will remain factory sealed forever. Still, I would like eventually try get Risky's Revenge reproduction as well. Definitely cool though to actually have a reproduction of a Game Boy Color game. It's pretty cool. The only 2 other games of Nintendo stuff are these, which are both 3DS games, which is interesting. Total limited run would only end up doing, I believe, something like 3 3DS games now. The first one was a digital exclusive to the original DS, and then the other was originally a digital exclusive on the 3DS. Definitely an interesting series of like mini games and stuff you would play. As you see, like it mentions 80 new stages. It's definitely different. And as you see, even shows there like number 2 and number 3. And sadly, these are the only other like 3DS games that have gotten released and will probably never be anymore, unfortunately. And another pretty cool reproduction, or first time at least officially licensed by Capcom, is a awesome physical release of the Mega Man The Wily Wars, which comes complete in like an original Sega Gen style box on the inside and everything, which is pretty cool. There you see like cards, a little art book, and all kinds of stuff, which is really cool. And now the collector stuff. First up, we have Ninja Turtles, Shredder's Revenge, and a VHS style box, which is actually really awesome. If you're a fan of Ninja Turtles, I do highly recommend checking out Shredder's Revenge, as it is a real spiritual successor of the original games. Really cool for any old school or actually new school fan. And in fact, it allows like online co-op up to 6 players. Is pretty cool. Also, the special version of Bloodstain Curse of the Moon 2, the cover art to this case is just drop dead gorgeous. As a longtime fan of Castlevania, I do really appreciate this series of Bloodstain. Next up is remaster of the original classic Star Wars Episode 1 Racer or Pod Racer. This being the collector's edition, designed like an original Nintendo 64 case, is pretty awesome. Then we have a pretty cool like giant version of like a Sega Dreamcast case. Love the artwork with obviously Dracula as well as Belmont. And this is a collection of a total of 8 classic games. Even a never before released Kid Dracula. Some of these games never originally got a release outside of Japan, so it was cool that they did do this collection. Next up, third to last, is Samurai Showdown, Neo Geo Collection, which is massive, and if you're a big fan of Samurai Showdown, this is a great collection with a total of like 7 games. Of course, you have like 2 versions like Sam Show 5. Still, I appreciate this collection for everything. In fact, this is a pretty good way to play the series as a whole, in my opinion. Second to last, pretty cool reproduction or remaster of the original classic Quake, which I remember back in the day, Quake on the N64 as well as on the Dreamcast. For me, Quake holds probably a bigger special place for me over rather the original Doom and stuff. Last but not least, I want to save this for last. This really awesome collection, Neo Geo Pocket Color Collection, which has a 10 superb games like SNK Gals Fighters, which is, by the way, very expensive if you want an original version of that game on the actual handheld. Some of these I actually do have physically, like 3 of them here, the Fatal Fury, Sam Show, King of Fighters, also have Match of the Millennium. Sadly, none of the Metal Slugs, nor do I have Big Tournament Golf. I instead have Turf Masters. Then you have some interesting games like this and others. It is a great collection, and I can't wait to play the second collection. But with that said, I'll see y'all next time. Stay safe out there. See you again. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel. Hopefully enjoyed the retro wave music in the background today.